Hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are joining us from. Thank you for being here with us today for the lunch and look of the new exhibition at the Art Gallery of Southwestern Manitoba titled Drawn from Wood, which just opened last night. My name is Lucy Letterhandler. I'm the curator here at the AGSM, and I am delighted that we have the means and opportunity to have all four artists and the curator of the exhibition joining us today from their homes in rural Ontario. This exhibition is about the process of making maple syrup, meaning that it's about receiving the gifts that the land gives us with a sense of gratitude and obligation. In her article, Land as Pedagogy, Leanne Betasumise Simpson recounts the Anishinaabe story of the little girl who discovers the sweetness of maple sap by imitating a red squirrel. And I think you'll see that this exhibition really addresses the same interconnectedness of things. So I invite you to reflect on all of those connections, think about the human scale versus an industrial scale of maple syrup extraction and how it's possible for extraction to be a kind of loving care if done correctly. We're going to be talking about some really ancient life today, and it's important that we don't take its continuity for granted. So holding that in my mind, we acknowledge the continuing stewardship of the people on whose land the AGSM is located, the Métis, Cree, Oji-Cree, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples. I am going to invite Heather Smith, the exhibition curator, to join me first today to tell us about the project. I'll remind you that anyone watching online can interact with us using the comments section of the platform. I'll see it here, and we'll address any questions or comments after we finish our tour. This talk is being recorded, and you are welcome and encouraged to revisit it, pass it around, do what you will. Because our guests are rural, we're only going to have one up at a time until the question period, just for the sake of saving bandwidth. So, without further ado, Heather Smith is an independent curator and historian who grew up partly in Campbellville, Ontario, where her family made maple syrup, and in Lagos, Nigeria. She has a BFA in Fine Arts from the University of Victoria and an MA in Art History from Virginia Commonwealth University. She has worked at the Anna Lee Owens Gallery at NSCAD, the Dawson City Museum in the Yukon, and was the director and curator at the Moose Jaw Museum and Art Gallery. She is currently working on a PhD in history and material culture at Western University. Upon reflection, she feels her curatorial focus has been on contemporary art and craft that references the evocative resonance of personal history and old things. She lives in a Georgian-style brick house built in 1840 near Port Rowan, Ontario. Welcome, Heather.
Hi, Lucy. Thank you so much. This is amazing. This whole, the format, the process, it's wonderful. It's exciting. This first time I've done a thing like this, so it's very nice.
It's a real treat to have somebody in the background doing production as well.
Right.
Shout out to Anna, as always.
You would really need that, but it's terrific. Okay, so I've been thinking about how this show came about, and so I worked at the Moose Jaw Museum and Art Gallery as the curator, your job there, for 18 years, and over that time I had developed this thing that seemed to work well there, which was we showed a lot of local and Saskatchewan artists, but we also sometimes invited artists from away to come to that place and respond to, well, mainly the landscape because it was, it's flat, but respond to the place in some kind of way. So that became a kind of theme in my curatorial work, was this invitation. So then I retired about 5 years ago, moved back to the area where my parents were from and our family was from for generations, and I just thought I could do this same thing here. I could invite people here to respond to this place, something about this place. And one of the aspects of it that I just love is making maple syrup. So I grew up making maple syrup with my parents and friends, whoever drops by or gets invited really to the woods in February, March is when it happens here. And that experience of being in the woods with other people, collecting sap, collecting wood, keeping the fire going, and and it's a lovely time in the woods. There's no leaves on the trees. There's no bugs. With no mosquitoes biting you, which is excellent. That experience of just being in the woods for a couple of weeks, off and on, depending on the weather, was just so lovely and hidden and instrumental kind of in my life and my experience of the land here, that I thought, well, I could invite some artists to come and experience that and then make work about it, and then we could propose a show. So I was kind of, retired, but I'm following this idea that I had kind of developed over years in Moose Jaw. So then I did invite some artists here, and we did go to the woods and make maple syrup. That was great. And then COVID happened, and then, time's gone by, and some changes to the group of artists came about because of that.
Yeah.
But
you had wanted it to be an iterative residency.
Yeah, I wanted it to happen a few different times. So this is the group of artists that met in 2019 in the spring. I think that's right. And this is a little cabin. So my this land, that the woods that you see behind you there, is 40 acres of Carolinian forest. So the Carolinian forest area kind of is rare in southern Ontario. It's right along the top of Lake Erie, and the trees that are there are unique to that area. But there are maple trees in there, along with some other trees that are go also down to North Carolina. So that's why it's called that. So there's tulip trees and ironwood trees and beech trees, but there's also maple trees. So this piece of land was in my family since 1850s, when my great grandfather got it. He actually got 100 acres. Now there was 40 acres here, and it was used for making maple syrup. And this land is very sandy and wasn't going to make good farmland. And there was a large tract of this land that's still just forest. And it's actually been purchased by the Nature Conservancy of Canada. So the sign you see there, if you want to come and visit, you just need to write down what this sign says. And you can look it up. And there's beautiful trails that you can follow into the woods. It's free and open to the public.
Is it called Bacchus Block?
Yeah, Bacchus Block. So there's a large area called the Bacchus Woods, and this woods was our little section of it that was it's adjacent to Bacchus Woods. And then the Nature Conservancy started buying up all this land, and they're still doing that. They're buying actually farmland that's adjacent to this and planting trees on it. They're really increasing the area of natural forest that's here, which is incredible. It's great of them to do that. And when my parents sold this land to the Nature Conservancy, they just made a deal with them that we could continue to make maple syrup there. So that's also great. Making maple syrup doesn't hurt the forest at all. And, we're just in there for a couple weeks in the spring. So my father, who's a retired architect, his name's Paul Smith, he designed that little cabin that you saw in the picture previous, and also a little structure that covers the pan where we make maple syrup. So I think your next picture, yeah. So this is the boiler, and so what you do basically is tap the trees. You put the sap into the pan that's on top of this fire, and you pick up branches and wood from the forest. As you're collecting sap, you're also drag a branch that fell down over the winter. Yeah. And you just keep this fire going, and you do that for, well, if you're lucky, if it's a good season, that might be about 2 weeks of work. And we just make maple syrup only. We never made it commercially. It was always just in our family, but extended family and gifts and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so, but near us, there are commercial operations with these incredible stainless steel, huge boilers where the sap goes in with tubing that all goes through the forest, and it's amazing to see. But that's not how we have ever done it. It's always been kind of this old school way, and my family were making maple syrup there starting in the 1850s. So it's kind of this long tradition of this lovely time out in the woods in the springtime. And then when we make the maple syrup, we just put it in like these jars, just a regular canning jar, and yeah, that's it. I don't know.
It's very modest, and these I like that idea of the pride in the architecture, the intentionality behind these design elements, creating that kind of aesthetic experience. I think especially being new to the prairies myself, it really feels like a strange place. That impulse to have other people experience it with me is strong. And I wonder how much reflection I would have to do to feel the same way about my hometown, which one just kind of takes for granted.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, that when you love a place, it's natural to want to invite people to come and experience it and see what it is that you love about it. And I think one thing about the woods and making maple syrup is it's kind of a hidden activity. You're way back in the woods, nobody can see you there, and you're kind of going through this thing that's really immersive, and no one else experiences it unless you invite them, or they're in your family, or they happen to be walking by, which is so nice, really.
So I'd like to do a quick tour of the exhibition before we focus on the individual artists and invite them up, because I don't think that you have seen nobody has seen anything except for me and Marianne up until yesterday. The entirety of the work.
That's right. I've seen documentation, and that works quite well actually for Gary and Victoria's work. These work well just as a slide that you see, but the installations pieces are much harder to get a sense of. It really looks beautiful.
So you can I don't know what your kind of structure of the residency was, but the ways that the artists responded were really run the gambit of really literal responses, and figurative, more abstracted things.
Yeah. You're right. And I love that about it, actually, that there is kind of like representational images. Look, you can see some sap buckets on a tree, but also, some of the work kind of gets to the feeling of the woods, or the feeling of trees, and sap, and liquid. That really is lovely.
Yeah. So, is there anything that you would like to say before I invite Brad up to join us?
Unless you can think of something that I seem to have missed in my
I think it's a good overview, and I am going to kick you off again because of bandwidth, but continue to take notes, and I'll see you at the end. And also, you can chime in with the chat whenever you like to, if you have a burning question.
Great. Okay, thank you, Lucy. That's great.
Let me introduce Brad Copping. He spent his early years in the East End of Toronto, living just a suburban block from the Scarborough Bluffs. I'll have to ask him what that unit of measurement actually means. So Scarborough Bluffs overlooking Lake Ontario. After that, his family bought a little cottage resort and moved to Sturgeon Lake between Lindsay and Bobcaygeon. He attended Sheridan College School of Craft and Design in the late 80s, and then was artist in residence at the Glass Studio and Harbourfront Centre in the late 90s. His well-received Mirror Glass Canoe, which many of you will be familiar with, that body of work began when he was artist in residence at the Canadian Canoe Museum, and that culminated in an exhibition at the Dutch National Glass Museum, as well as the Art Gallery of Peterborough and other locations. He now lives in the community hall of an old church just outside the village of Woodview, Ontario, that sits on a limestone shelf that drops into the granite of the Canadian Shield, a beautiful and unique transitional landscape known as the Land Between. And for everybody at home, you will notice as we read through these biographies, they were given to us for this show in particular, and they're so place-based. It's really interesting to define yourself based on the landscapes that you've moved through in your life. Welcome, Brad.
Thanks.
How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much. And thanks, Heather, again, for the opportunity to work on this show.
Really? So the piece that we have up now, it's a partnered piece. They're two different works, Weep and Transform, but they do go together. I keep calling it the shadow. The Transform is the shadow of Weep. And this is the opening piece in the exhibition as far as being the front of the exhibition hall. It's also the piece that we chose for our invitations. It's because that idea of drawing from wood is really manifested in this piece that you see in the foreground. So tell us a little bit about the product and your practice.
Okay. Well, okay. Let me start with my practice. My practice really runs two parallel directions. I am a glass blower. I'm trained as a glass blower. I create work, functional work. I put that kind of work out. But I'm also a sculptor and a mixed media sculptor, although I also use glass, quite a bit of glass in that work. What to say about my practice? Yes, with having a glass studio, you know, it's an energy intensive and expensive operation to run. So having a source of income from that directly is really important. So that's
when you say energy, you mean like hydro?
Both hydro and fuel, like propane.
Okay.
We're not on a natural gas line up here, so or down here, as it were, from where you are, relative to north and south. But yeah, the shield country doesn't work well with the gas lines. So propane it is, and that's looking a little frightening these days. But anyway, yeah. So the glass blowing is you know, keeping body and mind together, roof over the head, that kind of thing. With the sculpture is the heart and soul of what I do.
I'll say for anybody who's tuning in from Brandon that Brad has allowed us to carry a few of his commercial pieces in the gift shop, so you can come and look at those. Support that art.
Yeah.
Other side of the practice. Yeah.
Thanks, Lucy. So the piece Weep is actually cedar. It's Eastern cedar. It's not a hardwood. It would have been near impossible to drag that out of the woods. I had been eyeing up a cedar log that had fallen a couple of years ago, about probably about 1.5 kilometers back in the bush, and I was hoping to get my neighbor to help me drag it out, but the snow came. His machine couldn't get back there anymore. His 6-wheel buggy. So I ended up going back on snowshoes with a toboggan and cut the section of wood out and dragged it out myself, and then proceeded to carve it. And I was looking for this figure, this sense of figure that's in the wood. Some of the things I've been noticing around this kind of form, you know, you see these wrapped trees, protecting winter protection kind of thing, and there's other images that have come in my mind. My significant other is a weaver, and she's had this practice of taking the cloth that she weaves and wrapping herself in it and photographing herself out
Mm.
in various locations, and it's evocative of that. I think, you know, it's a whole other thing, but then seeing the burlap trees, it's like, oh, there's this living thing in the trees. This is sort of this connection again that keeps coming up in my work and in my head, of the fact that we're not just a part of nature, we are nature. Nature is like, we're not separate we can't be separated in
Yeah.
the truest form. And so there's a sense of that in this work. The glass drips coming out of the form. Every knot in the wood, or there's a couple of odd blemishes in it. That's where there's a drip forming. It's coming out. And so the idea of weep, like, not so much. I like the fact that it's also about tears, but that's not the initial intention. It's not about the crying, but about the seeping or weeping in that way of the sap from the tree. So there's that drop that falls was, and that was something that was really key in the experience of the residency, was seeing that drop come out of the spile and into the pail, and it's just that drop, and I think, you know, that's something that I tried to capture in one of the video works, but it is that drop that of sap, that drop of slightly sweet water.
Yeah. And that idea of exteriorizing something. There's something just so it's at once very dark, this piece, and also very just primeval, right? Something really noble about it. That idea of the shroud, or the solidity, the solid space. And I'm sorry, it turns out I didn't get any of the close-ups of Transform, but those are repurposed wine bottles, so the proportions are recognizable but kind of distorted as well, all of those pieces. Can you talk a little bit about those?
Sure. So those are actual wine bottles that I heat up in the kiln, pick up at the end of the blowpipe, and reblow into these bucket forms, and then I'm in the hot process, I'm popping a little hole in the back and creating the loop that it hangs from. And I've always been fascinated, not always, but, you know, there's been a time the last 10 years or so where I've started to try and use glass that is already formed in some way and then reform it. And it brings that history with it. So like you said, you see the marks, there's, you know, ribbing on the bottom. There's things about the embossing from the mechanical glass making process that is still there in those forms. So, but it's that transforming from one. It carries its history with it, and there's a conviviality around the drinking of wine, and I must admit that we did our share of that during the residency, and I think that was it was a joyous thing, this coming together as a group, having this experience in the woods and at Heather's home in the evening, boiling down the sap or boiling down the almost syrup that you take from the pan at the end of the day, and then finish it off on the stove in the kitchen, and just that whole sort of hanging out together was just
Mhm.
such a wonderful. It's a different kind of kitchen party.
Yeah. And I had never experienced the process, but I went on a tour with at our local Brandon Sugar Bush, and
Okay.
I'd never smelled it before. But that pervasive, it lingers too. I mean, it's steam.
Mhm.
Obviously, it smells when you're near the boiler, but even as you leave, there's something different about the nature of the air. I
Yeah.
don't remember the orders, but I want to skip right to here since we're talking about conviviality, because this is a yarn that somebody spun
Yes,
during that
yes,
time, right?
yes. He used to whittle. Heather's father joined us on. I'm not sure if it was every day, but he was out there quite a bit, and he's a gregarious storyteller. And I, I he told a story about an uncle of his when he was a young man, and what I've done, I've taken the bits of the story. I surreptitiously filmed the wood stove while he was telling the story and caught the audio of the story. And I've broken the story down into 40 small segments, and each of there are 40 cups um, around there's 41 cups altogether. The one with the dense writing is the entire story. The one with the others have just a fragment of the story enameled onto the glass. What I did was I filled each cup with 1 cup, measured 1 cup of water into each one, and mark the level. And so they're varying size. They're all free blown. I wasn't trying to reproduce exactly the same cup. So they vary quite a bit in diameter and height. And then the enameling fills the space of that 1 cup. The 41st cup, again, the same amount of space, but all of the story is on there, and this is referencing the 40-to-1 proportions from sap to syrup.
Right, right.
A simple thing in some ways, but when it's taken in terms of story, it does something else. I think there's something in there, and again, yes, the conviviality, the community of the experience was really powerful.
One of my favorite things about this piece, I don't know if there's 2 or 3 cups that just go, but anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
It reminds us all of somebody, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we skipped over, let me just pop back here. Ripple
Ripple.
are
Yes.
also a free bone, I imagine. They're more
Yes.
similar, but they're not identical at all.
No, they are not identical.
Yeah.
But they're close. They're close. And at a single glance, you might even think they are exactly the same if you don't look closely. But I found this steel ring, this incredibly beautiful steel ring, out on a walk. I can't remember. This was the first piece I made after the residency for this exhibition, and I had found this ring, and I knew I had to do something with it. It's this incredible, it's this incredible thing, this incredible symbol, this, but it's the circle, and for me it was that ripple. It's that again, that drop. When it hits the sap that's in the pail, there's this ripple that goes out. This ripple that continues to move, and that again, that group thing that we're doing, and how the experience moves through us all. The sound, trying to make the sound of that into a visual piece. So there is no sound, but I'm wanting to capture that. So the ring itself is not flat. It varies quite a bit in height, and then I I blew dozens and dozens and dozens of cups, and then tried to find the cup that would fit in to support it. So they all vary slightly, and they're very precise on the location, the turn of the cup, to find the right spot, because the cups are not level across the top either. They're a little higher on one side than the other, and so they are very specific. They are all unique, but they have a place. They have a place supporting this ring.
Mm-hmm. And there's 20 of them. Does that have a significance?
No, that was just the luck of the draw.
Nice round number.
Yep.
It's I think combining the idea of that vessel, and especially with glass, I think all of us, by all of us I mean myself, Matthew Ryan Smith at the Glenhurst, and Heather, all touch on that idea that glass and liquid have a real relationship, right? Especially when you're working with this translucent glass. But yeah, that frozen time and the thick end and the thin end creates this progression of kind of the potential of filling those glasses with the liquid, right?
Nice.
Yeah. Now, I'm really regretting, maybe I'm going to just be a little messy and find a video, but first, why don't you just talk to us about these pieces?
Okay, so these are two video pieces. There's a glass element that is essentially the screen for the projection to float on or float in, as it might be. Drip is simply, I as I said, I was fascinated with this drip and the sound of that drip going into these metal syrup buckets or sap buckets that were hanging on the tree, and I filmed into one of those buckets, and so what I've done is I've cropped the image of that falling drop, and it is projected onto that surface of the glass. Now I've tried to create a sense of this is the sap that is in the bucket without the bucket, so that it's just this thing that is happening. And I know when I had it set up in my home and doing this, the sound was quite amazing. How it rang out from this simple form. Evaporate is a series of glass bubbles that I made a whole mass of them, and then fused them in the kiln. Set up a form inside the kiln, and piled these guys in, and then brought them up to temperature, and then brought them higher, and then brought them a little higher, and just get everything to settle down and fuse together. So it's this mass of bubbles, and as the sort of mimicking the shape of the pan that you pour the sap into. So very simple representative pieces. The video footage that's projected onto this is of the pan, the actual pan at the Sugar Shack where we had the residency.
And this one in particular, because it's partially I don't know, sandblasted. It's partially translucent and partially transparent.
Yeah.
So the overall effect is this very internal glow. It almost looks like there's a fire within it. The projector is
nice.
Is the surface of a boiling piece. Yeah. And the drip, I was just browsing around looking for a video that I could share, but I can't. The remarkable thing is that it's a flat projection, but bounces around this interior space, so that there's actually a reflection every time that a drip hits the water. It actually bounces from the base of that sculpture.
Yeah.
So remarkable. Yeah.
Yeah. The glass acts as a as a receiver, but also as a projector. So it does something, and then reflecting back up. So the interior of that's a hollow form, and the interior of that has been sand etched so that it will hold the image. I found that without doing that, or I tried etching other forms on the top surface, and it wasn't as effective. But allowing the image to penetrate the thickness of the glass, they are quite thick forms, so that the light penetrates, and then it sort of spreads somehow and comes back up. It's the optics of, it's the nature of glass to do.
Yeah, well, it's quite literally a hologram, right? It's just this kind of analog hologram.
Nice.
So, yes, everybody follow us on things, and we'll get a nice video out to you. I'm sorry that my slideshow isn't, there's too many apps going.
Right. That's okay.
Yeah.
Come and see it.
Go and see it for sure. But if you're stuck in the bush of Ontario, then just keep us in mind. There's another shot of Evaporate, and this one is I was interested in what you said about the process, because much like Ripple, there's so much motion in this because the bubbles are all at a different state of decay. Right. There's even broken ones. Sitting at the top, kind of as though they had just broken, and some of them are collapsing under the weight of others, and really, really frozen in time, but with this really kinetic experience. Okay.
Excellent. Thanks, Lucy.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to kick you off, and I'm going to invite Marianne up next, I believe, indeed, with an introduction. Many of you will already be familiar with Marianne Barkhouse, not simply because of her renown, but it just so happens that our last exhibition was a solo show by her, though it was about a different tract of land from a different perspective. Marianne was born in Vancouver, British Columbia, and lives in the Haliburton Highlands of Ontario, in the forest on the shores of a beaver wetland. She has strong ties to both coasts, as her mother is from the Nimkishban Quaddle First Nation of Alert Bay, BC, and her father is of German and British descent from Nova Scotia. She is also a descendant from a long line of internationally recognized Northwest Coast artists that includes Ella Neal, Mungo Martin, and Charlie James. In 2020, she was the recipient of the Ontario Arts Council's Indigenous Arts Award. Marianne's artistic practice developed out of her personal and family experience with land and water stewardship. Her work often invokes animal imagery to explore themes such as empire, survival, culture, and ecological concerns, and I think that we will definitely see that in the work today. Welcome, Marianne. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well, Lucy. Thank you.
So this is an installation shot, but why don't...
Nice.
Pretty, so pretty.
Did a great job.
Thanks. We talked about this because you got to be in the actual space. It's kind of a quirky gallery because of the posts and everything. We were talking about creating a copse of trees. And I think that it really adds a lot to the atmosphere of the gallery, that you can kind of walk among them and they're kind of looming over you. This knit piece is 9 feet tall, I think. It's quite a tall piece.
Yes, and since I had been in the gallery, those were almost custom made for your gallery. So it'll be interesting to see how they work at the Glenhurst. But as some of you know, this is an evolving installation, but this has I'll backtrack a bit to say that I was not part of that original group that went to the to Heather's maple syrup bush. So I kind of came into things a bit afterwards, and then COVID hit, so I never did get a chance to go there. But I do live in adjacent. Actually, my forest is a sugar bush. My next door neighbor runs a large sugar maple operation. So I'm very familiar with our hardwood forest, the mixed hardwood forest that we have here, and sort of the community of trees and animals and so forth that make up the different constituents of this particular part of the country.
Yeah.
So, excuse me, get all choked up talking about trees, you know?
Get her started on beavers.
I know. Just wait. So so I wanted to bring in elements of like, for example, birch trees are extremely important in many types of forests, but they're quite prevalent on my property as well. There's certain, I'm trying to remember what the term is. I think it's antimicrobial or anti-fungicidal type aspects to the tree itself, which is why other trees will collect around it, because then those properties help other trees, other species of trees, to fight off fungicidal diseases that they take on. So that's why I had the birch as a prominent one in this particular installation. I will eventually be adding, I'll be growing my forest, and I will be adding maple trees and some of the other, and these will be with wool, like the rug hooking type of thing, because with that these techniques and that material, I was trying to bring in some of the textures of the forest when you go through. So you have, on the one hand, the cyanotypes, which have very very direct references and photograms of the different leaves from my forest. As well as the bark that has been pecked by the sapsuckers, which is where the hummingbirds feed off of. But I thought the birch tree was a really important one to start with, just for all those properties that I had mentioned. And then also looking at some of the different ways that maple sap has been collected over the years by Indigenous people. Now, my First Nation, we collected fish. We didn't collect maple syrup, but a lot of the Anishinaabe is very prevalent within Anishinaabe culture. And so I was looking at some of those, inspired not only by the materials that they used, which was birch bark, to collect the maple sap, but then also I was looking at ways of how different cultures have ways of, I guess, acknowledging something that's important, that has ritual, that's ceremony around it, and very much with, at sugaring time, as Heather has already spoken about, there is this ceremony that goes in, whether it's a small group of people, whether it's one person, whether it's there is very much sort of a ceremonial aspect, I think, to that's endemic to that process. So I've had, I guess some people know me from way long time ago, actually, when I was also at Harbourfront at the same time that Brad was at, except I was in the metal studio. I wasn't in the glass studio. And I was one of the resident artists there. So I used to do a lot of silversmithing type of work with raising forms from a flat sheet of metal. So, and one of the women that I studied under, Lois Etherington Betteridge, who just passed away recently, but she was 92 when she passed away, and she worked right up until the very end, just amazing and very inspirational. And she created a lot of different vessels for different clients because she was a silversmith and goldsmith. And so I sort of had that in the back of my mind, having watched and looked at her process, her production of creating things for different kinds of, like, cathedrals, Anglican, as well as Catholic, as well as Judaica, and these different vessels that are giving importance to a certain aspect of their culture. So I was kind of translating that over to the whole process of maple. So that's the long explanation for two of the vessels that you see here in oratorio. And because the idea of oratorio is many voices singing praise or prayer. And so in some of this, eventually, as well as some of the more trees that will be added, there'll be more critters that will be added to the installation. But you can see the beginnings of some of that at the base of the large birch vessel. There are several hummingbirds that are etched right into the copper, as well as one sapsucker. And then on the base of the smaller vessel, which I thought it amused me to use a little bit of plumbing as part of the stem of the goblet or chalice. Of course, alluding to the spiles and so forth that you would see. But saw pierced into the copper base are a variety of trees, which were, when I'm walking through the forest and you're looking up and you see this canopy above you, which maybe that would be a good time. I just had a few images that I was going to show, just as I'm not sure if I can. Oh, okay, there they are. So this is one of the things that had inspired that I was using as inspiration for my contribution to the exhibition. Was I was thinking of how these trees, not the community that these trees live in, but also how they're used by other species of birds and animals. So of course there's animals like deer browse on maple quite a bit, as do just the variety of woodland creatures that make use of them for a variety of ways. Now this is actually a piece of birch, and that's so that's been thoroughly packed by some sapsucker. And I think, as Heather had mentioned, and some people had mentioned in the writing about my work, was that I was about this time one year, I saw hummingbirds start to show up, and there's no flowers around for them to drink the nectar from. So I was worried about them, and then I read, as I have to worry about everything, and I found that that's what hummingbirds up in this region of the country live on when they first come up. They live off of the sap that comes out of the holes that are drilled by sapsuckers and woodpeckers. So in this image, there's a few. Now we'll see if I can change it here. So that's a couple of. So on the top view, there's the maple bark that's been packed, and then of course my chalice there. Yeah. So then you can also see
it looks kind of like a language, the patterning, right? It looks like they're trying to communicate somehow.
Yeah, it is very, and it's it almost the other thing that came to me is a type of fancy French lace. Yeah, in a way. Yeah. So these are just some images of the inspirations that I had, and also why the color choices and the material choices that I've made when fabricating these different elements. So for example, I've made extensive use of copper, some naturally patinated copper that had been left out in the elements, as well as like some fresh copper. And there you can say, wait, wow.
This one?
Hold
okay.
on. Let's see. Oh, well.
Control? I don't know if you have control.
Let me see if I can. Oh, there you go. Okay. Well, so then when you look at the copper, when I'm walking through the forest, I see a lot of these lichens that are growing on the barks of the trees. And I'll just go back a little bit. This is just, again, when I'm in some of these I have been in large cathedral type spaces. And I, like a lot of people, when I'm walking through the forest, especially when I'm out in British Columbia, but here as well, that the evocative of these sacred spaces that you have when you're in the forest and underneath the canopy. So then there's just like the yellow birch and the white birch, the white paper birch. They quite often, I have some trees that are completely twined together, that grew together as they've aged, which is just beautiful. And so that shows, that it just feels like they're really part of a neighborhood or community. And there's one of my hummingbirds. It hasn't shown up yet, but one of the male hummingbirds that's usually at my place in the summertime. And again, some close-ups of the bark. So if I go back to this informs the choices that I've had for some of the materials in this, with going with some raw linen when I'm doing like this rug hooking type thing. And when I've done these, it's funny, go right from metal smithing to rug hooking, something really hard, something really soft and squishy. But when I was looking at some of the other pieces that I've done, not in this exhibition, but for something else, and I was thinking, well, the back and the front are evocative of very different things. And it's unfortunate that if they're used as a rug, you never see the back because it's facing the floor. So that's why I decided I would use that as a process, but also a material for some of my hangings. Yeah, and as well with the cyanotype, I enjoy doing cyanotypes because again, you're working with forces of nature. It's a very simple process, very old process. It goes back to the early 1800s. There's no silver in it. It's like the chemistry that reacts to the sun. So it's just sun and water that you use in addition to these toxic chemicals. But well, they're not so toxic, but anyway, I was just trying to bring it into these ideas of using cycles of nature to be literally developing some of the artwork. But going fast forwarding to one of my last slides here, one of the animals that usually doesn't eat maple is a beaver. So, I mean, just about everything else is on their diet. I have seen them take down maple, and occasionally they seem to use them for building, like in their dams or their lodges. I've never seen them eat the bark the way that they do with poplar or aspen. So, and then this on the very corner, this is actually from another installation that I had back in my forest about a year and a half ago. I brought back this pew that I had, actually a pew that came from a church that Victoria told me about years ago. And I painted "Don't Panic" on the pew, and I had some friends bring it to the back of my forest. So it was, and then I had these trail cams to monitor the activity of the different animals that were interacting with the pew. And I actually, where they were where normally you would have prayer books and things like that, I had books that were molded in the shape of a bird seed that was molded in the shape of a prayer book sitting on the pew. And then there was a big storm. And so it said, "Don't panic," because this is at the beginning of the pandemic a couple of years ago. So I don't know why I had Douglas Adams' book and my Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy in my head, but I thought, yeah, don't panic, everyone. Let's just take a breath. And but then as a tree came down, a maple tree, a massive maple tree, just came down and hit that and just completely blasted the pew to smithereens. So I thought, I don't know, maybe it's time to panic, but it was a maple tree that did it. So that's why it made it into my slideshow. So that's just a little bit of background on some of my work.
Is this image on the left, is that a tree that they gave up on, that the beaver gave up on? What am I looking at?
Oh, actually it is.
Yeah.
But that's actually an old beaver tree, and that's not maple. That's a poplar. But it's an old. If I shown the whole thing, you could see that the end was beaver chewed. But it just it's near a particularly damp part of the forest, so the lichen and the moss was just like this beautiful little velvety cloak that was on it.
Yeah, mini forest, tiny little forest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, fab. I'm going to take back over.
Yeah, you take back over. But thank you. That's a beautiful, beautiful installation. I just want to say thank you to you and Kevin. And if you had any other assistance, the whole show looks fabulous. And having the chalices and two little levels, I think it just looks great. Thank you. Great.
Fabulous. And
a big shout out to Heather too for being patient. I meant to send her images, but I never did it. So I don't know. I'm a liar. I'm sorry.
We may eventually expect some little gargoyle spiles as well.
little gargoyle spiles, and get ready for it, a lid. You know how a lot of maple buckets have lids, because that's the other thing is, unfortunately, Heather can probably speak to this too, that you'll find the people I know that have had maple bushes that still do it with the buckets. You'll find things in there. You find bugs, but sometimes birds are in there and they've died, and it's sad. So there's the tops for the maple. So one of the pieces I've spiles, and it just keeps growing, but now it's like a kind of a top for a maple bucket with, you'll have to wait. I know. I'm tantalizing you.
It'll be a second opening for us. And I talked
about
the small vessel with the out pipe. That seems like a reference to a spile as well. So it's one that.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Fab. Okay. I'm going to kick you off and bring.
Okay. Thank you.
Gary now.
Gary and Vic
now. Okay. Away with you. And so I'm going to start by introducing Gary, just because in the slideshow, yours is the next work that comes up. People at home will notice that this video is a little bit different. So what we're going to have to do is either see the artist or see the artwork, and I'm just going to switch back and forth between them. So Gary Blundell was born in central London, England, and lived there for a few years until his family moved to Ottawa, Ontario. He was the lead singer in a psychobilly band and later a swing band in the Ottawa area, and was involved in organizing Artist Front Center exhibitions and studio spaces in Ottawa and Toronto. He completed a BSc degree, a Bachelor of Science degree in Geotechnical Earth Science, now called Geological Engineering, at the University of Waterloo, and became head of the research department at the Canadian Wildlife Federation in the late 80s, early 90s. During a 2011 arts residency in Yorkshire, England, his work, Bituminous Illuminations, addressed the impact of coal mining on landscape and people. This work has been widely exhibited, including one installation in the Victorian coal mining buildings that are now part of the National Coal Mining Museum for England. He lives in a log cabin built in 1898 by bootleggers in a woodsy part of central Ontario, an hour north of Peterborough. The subject of his conceptual landscape painting is both deep geological time and the human connections to resource extraction. Welcome, Gary. So I think you can see my screen. The first thing that I want to do is take a tour down the Oil on Wood series. So that's these 9 paintings, mostly 40 inches tall, so quite substantial and deeply routed. And as a curator, I'm always really interested in the titles of things. They don't necessarily need to, but especially when you have a really cohesive series like this, I think titles can give such insight into intentionality and the nuances of your meaning. So why don't you tell us a little bit about those works on wood, those oil on wood pieces? Oh, sorry. I can't hear you, and I think that's an Anna thing.
Oh, okay.
Oh, there you are. Okay, go ahead.
You hear me now?
Yes.
There's a bit of a delay because of the system we're using, but yeah. Well, half of those pieces were done based on the landscapes around Heather Smith's place, and the other half were done here. I mean. The fact was that we were intending to do a second residency with Heather, and then COVID came along and put a kibosh on that. So I didn't feel like I had quite finished the work that I wanted to do for the exhibition, and so the second half are about half of the pieces are based on some trees right around my own property, and again so I'll go backwards. I'll start with the stuff that I did here first. I mean, after, I had Brad and I and Marianne and Victoria were all able to get together after the first residency, but before the pandemic hit. And she did mention, she was talking about sapsuckers, and of course, I love sapsuckers for many reasons. They're really neat looking, but they also have a voice that sounds like Edward G. Robinson. So I really like that. They have a kind of, and I always think they're going to say something like, you can't do that to Rico. But anyway, I mean, they never do say that. And if they did, I guess, that would be an interesting day. But, I mean, after that conversation with Marianne, I actually did a really good survey of my own property here. And, we don't have a lot of maples on the property. There's a lot more maples down on that property that Heather's family used to own than here. But we do have a lot of birch trees, and the sapsuckers really have had a good go at them. And so I would say about half the paintings are based on those markings that the sapsuckers place on the trees. The earlier group, like this one here, for example, are kind of sort of like, I mean, it was a difficult thing for me. I had never really worked off of a kind of, like a heavily forested landscape before. A lot of the work that I do is mostly on old mine sites, but I was trying, but I really do love sort of transitional times of the year. And one of the things that's really great about when you're out collecting maple syrup is that the earth is kind of coming back. And so there's a lot of land that's been buried in snow for a long period of time, and it's slowly re-emerging. And I love the line as the snow is melting away and the land is re-emerging from underneath. It always looks completely different for a very, very short period of time before sort of like vegetation takes over. And I really love that line between the re-emerging land and the snow. And so the most of the paintings that I did on Heather's place were about that. It wasn't easy for me to do these kinds of pieces on wood without just kind of investigating the landscape that I found myself in during the activity. So it's not so much based on the maple syrup, but it's based on the landscape that I saw around me as I was collecting sap for in the buckets and to boil. And I just kept coming across these beautiful lines. I mean, about half of the sap that we collected was in kind of a swampy type of area. And so as I'm there kind of plodding around in my boots and the snow is melting away, I kept seeing these beautiful lines as the snow receded. And a lot of the paintings were based on that. So it's about a 50-50 split in these.
But what's interesting, and we're going to look at some of your smaller paintings as well, but you're a geologist, you're interested in deep time, and then here you're using the seasonal cycle and finding something as profound in these very, very temporary ecosystems that form, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
And then there's a few outlier pieces that are quite literal, as me and Heather were talking about earlier. But we can see here very clearly that receding snow as ecosystem, as entire ecosystem, something called an ecotone. Mossfoot.
Well, that first piece too. I mean, when it never really occurred to me until I talked to Heather that they collected maple syrup in the Carolinian forest. Having worked for the Wildlife Federation in the past, and I was the head of the research department, and I actually oversaw the development of a lot of recovery plans for endangered species. I chaired committees that did that. And one of the things that I found that was very sad was that the Carolinian forest had been, getting used up, and that a lot of the species that relied on a kind of depth of forest, if you will, like a certain size of forest, were on these endangered species lists. So when we talked to Heather initially about doing the project down there, one of the things that really intrigued me was the fact that the Nature Conservancy was protecting a lot of this landscape. And I thought, that was the sort of thing that we were talking about 20 and 30 years ago that needed to be done. So I thought, oh, great. Well, here's a great example. But, it's not a forest that I'm very familiar with. I mean, we all live up here in the boreal forest, and it's considerably different. So, I mean, one of the things that I noticed when we went down there was there's just like very different kinds of trees. There are some that we're familiar with, but there's also these vines that are just all over everything. So I was kind of fascinated in that. So I did a piece based on that. But it was just really great to be in a different kind of forest collecting syrup as opposed to the forest that I'm used to being in. So I found that very inspiring, and some of the drawings came out of that.
The big difference is that the Carolinian forest is sediment, and the boreal forest is kind of on granite. So it has is that accurate?
Yeah, I think most of the boreal forest is on the Precambrian shield. So, there's a really, really old body of granite that's really close to the surface, all up here. And then when you get down a little bit further, you get into kind of more basins around the Great Lakes and things like that. So, yeah, there's a lot more sediments. That's why they're better areas for agriculture and things like that. And it's just a warmer climate too. So you get, it doesn't feel as coniferous as it is here. And then you do get these kind of like tulip trees and like just really, really, like giant magnolia trees.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love a magnolia tree, but it never occurred to me that it could be so big. So there's just really interesting things like that. And so it just, I have spent a lot of time in my life collecting maple syrup over the years, having come from Ottawa, and spending a lot of time in the Gatineau Hills. But I had never done anything like that in that kind of forest. So it felt like an act that I was used to performing, but in a very exotic landscape that was different. So it was very inspiring.
I want to move on to these gouache and graphite on paper. So again, with this melting snow, this receding line, this ecotone territory, and I think what you're achieving with gouache here is it really gives me a lot of insight into that really geometrical routered wood as well, just as far as noting patternings that occur by creating kind of essential shapes.
Well, I see the router as actually kind of just a different kind of drawing tool, really. So when I'm working on the big oil paintings, the router is sort of my pencil, if you will. And I mean, in the routered pieces, I'm kind of overlaying a sort of idea of human development. I mean, human beings didn't always used to do what they do now, but nowadays we develop a lot of our communities as grids. And as now living out in the prairies, when you're flying over the prairies, you can often look down at a city from an airplane, and it looks like a computer chip or something. It's all very, very gridded. I lived in Calgary for a while. I was also very fascinated about the whole fact that everything was all sort of like north, south, east, and west, and gridded out and numbered out in that way. Very organized and gridded. Sometimes when you're working on a particular landscape, the patterns that are there can be very complicated. And, your natural tendency is to kind of like try to create a system of patterning that's more in keeping with what we do. And so like the grids just kind of flow out of me. But in the routers, that sort of seems to happen. When I'm working on the drawings, I'm not leaning towards that quite so much. I'm thinking a little bit more I'm working a bit more with the patterns that I observe rather than kind of imposing something. And I mean, here, the two of the things that I was really, really fascinated with was the fact that in this particular swamp that I was collecting syrup in, there just seemed to be a lot of downed trees. It almost seemed like a kind of a burial ground for trees, if you will. And they had all been buried in the snow, and they were all just kind of re-emerging and sort of lying there in the snow. And I don't know, they were really beautiful. And the bottom ends of them, you can see all the root systems and all the kind of leaves were all attached to it. And it was just really visually sort of stunning. So I kind of focused on that. And then, you know, the other pieces that have the kind of circular imprint at the bottom of the trees. This is just something that I've really been observing a lot here too. It seems that the trees must have a kind of a heat in them, if you will. Like there always seems to be when the land is warming up, when the air is warming up, when spring is coming, the first thing that seems to happen, and this happens around buildings, and it makes sense because we heat the buildings, but you do notice the same thing in trees too. Like there's a bit of a ring that forms around the bottom of them, and you know, it's the first thing that kind of melts. So it's like some warmth that must be in the tree that's creating this sort of circular pattern. And when I was out in that swamp again collecting syrup, it wasn't so much that these holes were opening up like I would see in deep snow around here, but what I did notice was that these really interesting patterns of melt that were starting to form in around on the ice from the swamp. And so it was just a really, really aesthetically pleasing sort of thing. So here I am, you know, I'm working, you know, collecting sap out of buckets, but I'm looking down and I'm seeing all these incredible patterns of circles at the bottoms of the trees. And it was just something that we have noticed here in a different way in the past. And I just thought, well, okay, well, this is something I'm really sort of tickled with here, for a lack of a better term.
Yeah.
And so I just did a series of drawings of them. You know, it was that, like, for me, it's always about like, okay, I kind of plunked myself into these situations where, all right, I'm going to try to make some art about this particular moment in time, this particular experience, this particular place that I find myself in. You know, for sure, I go to a lot of places where we're extracting resources for our own use. It was nice to be in an environment where the resource extraction activity was something that wasn't tearing the trees down so much. It was just collecting the syrup from them. And I'm thinking, okay, well, what is it about this particular environment that I find kind of artistically inspiring? So I was just looking for things like that. You know, it wasn't, I thought, you know, I didn't think I could just draw a bunch of pictures of sap buckets, although I did a little bit of that, but it wasn't something that I thought I could really spend a lot of my time on. It's not really what I do. But yeah, so that was kind of where a lot of that came from. It's pretty simple, really, to be honest with you.
I think that of the four artists, you're the one that really approached this as research creation the most, and it's something that I relate to very much. Where when you need to write something, what you need to do is just sit down and write, and eventually it's going to be the thing that you mean to be writing, right? Speaking of very literal pieces, and you may have noticed that we missed one of yours, and it's because I'm cheeky and I couldn't stand to separate you two, so I put you on Victoria's wall as she
Well, I'm
traveled.
glad you did that, actually, because frankly, I mean, you know, Victoria has a real penchant for creating, you know, little lonely buildings out in the woods. She's really drawn to them, and
Right.
there was something, you know, Heather's dad is a great guy, Paul. I mean, he came out with us a lot of times, and I visited Heather on several occasions prior to this too, and I really like her family. And anyway, I just wanted to do something that kind of honored the fact that he built this whole building. I mean, I took out really everything else. I just concentrated only on the building. I mean, if you see pictures of it, it's surrounded by maple trees. But I just really wanted to focus in on Paul's bit of architecture. So that's what I did there. It's kind of like a tribute to him.
Yeah, I appreciate it as well, because you in this drawing, for example, those pillars, I hadn't noticed just in the photograph, but that those real aesthetic decisions that were made.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah, they were tricky because of the vanishing points of them. Were not an easy thing to achieve, to be honest.
Yeah.
If they were just columns, it would have been a lot easier. But again, you know, like the funny thing about when you're drawing something like that is you don't necessarily notice those things yourself, even when you're there. But when you sit down and you're working on a drawing of them, suddenly you're like, oh my God, what have I got myself into here? This thing is really a lot trickier to draw than I was anticipating it was going to be. And those pillars were an example of that.
Yeah. Okay, so why don't you switch places while I introduce Victoria.
Okay.
And I'll see you in time for a big conversation.
Yeah, the show looks great, by the way.
Oh, good. Thank you. Victoria Ward grew up in Toronto and lives in the same log cabin in the Boreal Forest near Algonquin Park, Ontario, that Gary lives in. She has a BFA in theatre from York University and spent many years in Toronto working in the alternative theatre scene. She co-ran a theatre company and wrote, directed, and acted in innovative theatre and art performances. Her visual art practice remains connected to people and community and focuses on buildings and landscape. She has developed bodies of landscape work that have had interactive engagements with communities ranging from Iceland to Cobalt, Ontario, and feels her most extraordinary experience was in Barnsley, Yorkshire, England, exhibiting her work during the 25-year anniversary of the coal strikes. In 2018, on Kashawagamog Lake in Halliburton, I believe that's how you pronounce it, she organized an ice fishing hut event where the community helped to build huts that served as exhibition spaces for local contemporary artists. These huts, including one exhibiting her paintings of ice huts, were part of a weekend event that Victoria instigated that attracted over 1,000 people and national media attention. Her visual art is intricately tied to community engagement and landscape and rests somewhere between storytelling, theater, and visual art, which we will see in the series that she created for Drawn from Wood. Welcome, Victoria.
Hi, Lucy.
So let me take over the screen for a moment. This is your wall, and we've talked about it's almost a dramaturgical process, the way that you went through the residency experience. So there is the setting done by Gary, and then the secret messages here, which have a secret in them. Do you want to start by talking to us about Dearest?
Yeah, sure. I started out in the 90s as a kind of a writer and a performer. So I wrote for theater, not visual arts, but so I did that for years. So writing has always been text has always been a thing for me. And over the years, I've tried really hard to put those two things together in my visual practice, and it's not always very successful. So, I did a bunch of stuff for Drawn from Wood that was like text visual based, and it just like none of it. It just, I don't know. It's like when you put those two things together, like Brad's beautiful piece with the glasses with the writing on it, like that's an example of a beautiful, successful example of like text and visual art together. And I would love to do that, but it's like sometimes it just doesn't work for me. So I thought, okay, I'll just separate out the text. And one thing that's so great about maple syrup collecting is what I've noticed: people who take it casually or take it really seriously or whatever, they tend to have either a journal or a diary. They tend to write down like what they've been doing, and this piece, Dearest, is a kind of it's a bit of it almost has a performative aspect to it, because it's kind of like you imagine it sitting in the building, the Sugar Shack building, where you're heating your sap, or you're just hanging out and you're drinking coffee all afternoon, and you're just talking, and you're just hanging out together. And then, when you leave for the day, you might write like, well, we collected X amount of buckets and da-da-da-da-da. But then I started thinking like, and I've done maple sugar a lot, and I've seen people do this. They either have a book or they have a thing that they write on the wall, and then the next person that comes to the next day will see what you've done. And so there's this exchange, there's this wonderful text exchange that happens with maple syrup, which is kind of unintentionally, but it becomes very, very sweet. And then I started ruminating on this idea, like, well, what if you wrote down like, oh, bring these CDs or whatever. And then what if the conversation got even more intimate, where you realize like, oh, wait a second, like this is a way I can meet that person, and we can say we're doing maple sugar, but we're doing something else, right? Like it just was very organically happened, because Paul's, like Gary and Heather and everybody has mentioned, Paul's little room that he made, this little building that he made, had a really serious romantic aspect to it. And I thought, yeah, like, you're hanging, like Brad talked wonderfully about the camaraderie and hanging out together for hours on end like that was really, really fun. But then I also thought like, well, this could also be very romantic. So that's where, so Dearest, actually it was Dearest I did first. And it sort of really started my whole pathway towards the rest of the war.
Yeah. So this stage set and the way that you use the sugar shanty, I believe the Smiths call it, is you repeat the same silhouette again and again. There must have been some kind of stenciling process or something like this. So this is a really emotional one. Matthew Ryan Smith points out how distanced you are, how far away it always is, just because of the scale of it. So would you like to talk about these? So this is two that are both 16 by 16 inches. So again, just this kind of smaller scale, and done in this very organic way, in this very, I think that you probably have a lot of scraping and palette knife work in here as well.
Yeah, so those two pieces are really very important pieces for me. The one with the buckets, the sweet secret is definitely following that narrative that I'm trying to talk about in terms of a lover's meeting. And I was just playing around with this idea of like, there's buckets on a tree and things that, like, the buckets on the tree thing in maple syrup making is really poetic and beautiful, because it's like there's these things hanging from the tree and they're kind of gentle, but they're doing something to the tree at the same time. So there's this wonderful, like, you can really ruminate on what's going on there. And I think the show and the wide variety of work that's done in the show is a good example of that. So that was to me, but then I also thought, like people when I was, you carve into trees, and there's that incredible cliche where, you put the heart and Tracy loves Stacy or whatever. And I was just thinking like, that's so tacky, but yet it's kind of like also a symbolic idea of love and stuff like that. And like, what if I put that on a sugar shack, like a sugaring tree? And on, like, at first when I was kind of horrified, because I thought like, oh my God, I just gave this beautiful tree and this beautiful poetic idea a freaking tattoo. And I was like, what am I doing? But then the more work I started to do, the more I went, oh, okay, no, actually this is kind of like, it's part of the narrative. The other piece with the little orange stencil, and you're right, it is the same shape. It's the same stencil every time. And I do that for quite a bit of my work, where I use the same shapes because it kind of denotes the idea of, well, many different ideas. Like it denotes an idea of a person, or it denotes an idea of a home base, or just like a centric idea to life. But that particular piece is, yes, it's scraped and it's beat up. It was actually, I think 2 other paintings before it became that one. And I was very, very, I was very influenced by the artist John Brown, who passed away really suddenly during the pandemic in 2020. And he was a mentor of mine and a very, very good friend, very dear friend. So it was a very, very challenging loss to deal with. And I sort of did this painting in response, and it was for him. And then it actually then became, I don't know, it fit into the show, because I think I was playing with these themes of love. And I know that John was this enormous romantic who was very, very, very successful artist in this country, and that's hard to do. And he was financially successful, which is really unusual. And he lived in Toronto and was fine, and like that's unusual. But he yearned for great love. Like he often said to me, I'd give it all up if I could just be passionately in love with someone. And that was really potent to me. And I think that flowed into my work for this show. I think because I was doing the work over the pandemic, and I was dealing with a lot of loss, and including John, there was a couple of other people that I lost over the pandemic. I thought, God, love is an important element in our life. And it imbued a lot of my work. But, not to get too heavy, I tend to also try to have some fun and make my work playful. I do that deliberately. So I just was playing around with with both those sides of the idea.
And then this small series of four, they're 4x6. You can kind of see the scale of the pins that are holding them up. This, I think, when you take them as a series, really speaks to that idea of earnestness and play that's at work in the work. Specifically, when you compare Heart and Glitter, right? Which are Heart is quite gruesome even, and then Glitter is quite delightful, right?
Yeah.
Um,
And kind of gay, which I love.
yeah. And Inside and Outside, I think, are they really spoke to me from the beginning, from the first time that I saw them, because especially having spoken to you about this lovers retreat, this sensuous experience of maple syrup extraction, the ominousness of this. I always thought of them as kind of crows coming in or something. And then in here, it's about being protected from the world, right? It's about rejecting everything else that's outside, done in just this single pairing of Inside Outside.
Yeah, well, you totally nailed what I was getting at, and I agree. Those two pieces I personally quite love. We had this amazing experience at the sugar at Heather's Sugar Shack one afternoon when like a gazillion starlings flew into the forest, and it was the middle of the day and it was a very sunny day, and they filled the sky and made it completely dark. And then they made this sound, like, because there were so many of them, it sounded like a train was driving right through the forest. So it was this really remarkable experience. And I was like, how do I evoke that? I don't know if I succeeded or not, but I had to do something about it. And so that's kind of where that idea came from. It was a remarkable natural wonder type experience.
Yeah. And this one, I think, Starlings directly references that.
Yeah.
And similarly, that it's ominous in this, especially because it's a solid mass of black shape that has this really smoky quality to it as well. And it is the experience of being surrounded by a murmuration is unlike anything else. You don't need to believe in magic in order to find it as remarkable as that. Then
yeah, I totally agree. Yeah. It was an amazing experience, and I guess it was also kind of like one of those wondrously goth experiences too.
Yeah.
That when I was younger, when I was super goth, I lived for moments like that, So it's funny to have them now, when I'm like doing maple syrup and stuff like that. I was taken right back to why I love nature, It was one of those.
Yeah. This heat here, I want to see if I can find that that picture by Heather here of the wood burning oven. And I love this as the conclusion of the work. There's still one more piece left on your wall, but just the aesthetic experience of it. I think that there's something about this piece, Heat, that reminds me at once of Gary's kind of research creation approach of just sit down and draw what you see, but also intensely tied into that kind of communicating that art can do, that kind of, that it is hot, literally. It's also passionate. It's also bright. It's also all of these things at once.
Yeah, it is. And it's kind of boring, right? Like that's the other aspect to that piece is that it's a square. And I thought, like, I just started to draw the square of the thing. And I thought, I'm just gonna leave it like that because it's kind of like a screen. So it was almost like this weird sense of television in the middle of the woods where you're just sitting there. Like at one point, everybody took off and they were doing something else. They're like, "Oh, can you mind the fire guitar?" And I just sat there like, for like half an hour, and I realized like, this is actually kind of boring too, So there was a little bit of that in there too.
Yeah, I love that. The boring is important too. The final
I
piece.
agree.
Yeah. The final piece of your series is also the largest one, titled Nest Chapel. And the cabin is still recognizable, but the treatment is quite a bit different, not only because of media, but you kind of expanded the composition into two different segments. So the landscape is dual in this piece. Do you want to talk about that for us?
Sure. This was such a struggle. I make a lot of paintings, and then I either reuse the surfaces or I do something different with it. So I just rework stuff all the time. So this is, could you just, sorry, phone. So this piece actually came out of a reworking idea where I wanted to show the sort of intensity of the where the sugar was being boiled down. Like it was kind of like there was steam that went all through the forest, and it was really hot, and it would boil, and there was a kind of almost like it was like a medieval cauldron or something. So there was this intensity to it. But then I also wanted to branch out and show, because I realized, like Brad and Gary are both like so much more observant of the natural world than I am. I'm not like the other three artists in this group at all. Like I'm not as up on my environment. I don't know anything. I don't know much about birds. I'm not like, Gary tells me about birds and I go, oh, okay, nice. But I'm not like Marianne. I don't have passion about these things. Like I learned so much from the three of them, which is that's why it's very exciting for me to be in a show with these guys. But I'm not that kind of person. So I thought like, okay, well, I got to go and look at so I started looking at the land, and I realized that, it was this kind of hilly land, and there was like rock formations, and there was other stuff. And I just wanted to expand out, and because I hadn't done that yet. It seemed like all my work seemed to be tiny and kind of claustrophobic. And I thought, no, I want to make something that's like shows this, sets the scene, or something like that. And so that's kind of where the emphasis came from.
Yeah, there is something about when you say claustrophobic on small pieces. I don't think that the content or the composition is claustrophobic, but there's that just the understanding that your muscles were moving so minutely, and when you go larger, your gesture is bigger, right?
Yeah, and I work small generally, and so that big piece was like a fantastic challenge for me. It was very challenging for me to get to where it ended up. So.
Great. I think it's fantastic, and I love the values that you've achieved there.
Thank you very much.
There's a close up, so you can see all of that additive, reductive treatment of it. Okay, this is the view looking back. I'm going to take off my slides and invite everybody else up. I'll remind people who are watching from home that they can pose questions to the artist and curator in whatever in the comment section of whatever platform you're using. But I will get the ball rolling by addressing the thing that everybody has been talking about how you don't address, which is this kind of nationalistic, this patriotism surrounding the maple tree and the bounty that it provides. Was that something that everybody had decided, or did we think that it would be boring to do? Did everybody come up with this on their own, that we weren't going to talk about Canada? I'll open with Heather.
No, I think you're right, though. There is this kind of patriotic national idea that maple syrup is something, to be experienced. So school kids get bussed out there, and sometimes, it's the wrong time of year there. It's close, but it's not actually happening. So they're just boiling down sap that it's a stage set sort of experience that children in Canada go through. And I'm so happy, really, that we didn't do that in this show, that we are at the root of something about community and the woods and, just experiencing this place. And it's just so much broader and bigger than the nationalistic, the commercialized aspects of it. I just love that we didn't really touch on that, although we could have, and that could have been, funny and good too. But I think we added so much to the conversation.
And to the artists, yes, Gary?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you bring this up because I have a little story to tell. And when we were over in Yorkshire and we were giving a talk to a group of local folks about the work that we were doing over there, researching the coal mining areas in that area, we had to put a kind of a slideshow together, a bit of a talk about all the work that we had done in different places. And we thought, okay, well, we want to interest these folks. So we talked about, the work we had done in other coal mining communities and this or that. But one of the things that we mentioned was that Victoria had done a lot of drawings and paintings of maple sugar shacks. And it was the thing that got them all really excited. So, I mean, whether we like it or not, they wanted to hear a bunch of Canadians talking about the maple syrup production.
Yeah,
it's very exotic when you leave the country. It's like a totally different kind of thing. And we were like, oh, they want to talk about this.
Yeah.
And it was, we were kind of tickled by it, really, Anyway, that's just a bit of an aside, I guess. But I thought that was a funny story to touch on.
Yeah, that's an interesting question of what, this exhibit outside of Canada and I guess the Northeast states, it would have completely different meaning. It would be archaeological, anthropological, right? Yeah. Marianne, do you have any thoughts of that?
No, I don't know. I might be the wrong person to ask about Canadian nationalism.
Oh man!
Don't
There's-
wave that flag. Don't wave that flag. Means something.
Mind
else.
you, I think I've said before that years ago, a fellow artist introduced me to a Dutch artist by saying, "This Marianne. She's the most Canadian person we know because her dad's a Mountie and her mom's Indian." And this was back in the day when you said Indian. So I don't know. I just thought best not to deal with that. There's so much else to deal with as far as it was amusing though. It was amusing to think about that.
And Brad, I think as the most sensorial of the works in this place, because you have your sound and you were interested in the movement and these frozen movements, was there just no time to think about national identity?
I think it's something I want to skirt around. I've done a bunch of work around canoes in the past, and it's another place that you can get lost in that stereotype. And yeah, it just didn't seem like it wasn't getting to the crux of the experience. It wasn't about that on that big scale. And yes, it is Canadian, but it is very specific geographically Canadian.
Yeah.
Like it's not the entire country.
Yeah. And the maple trees don't know when they become Canadian or American maple trees either.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's also interesting in Heather's curatorial statement. you never say it's about the maple. You never say it's about the syrup. You say every time you take the time to say this is about the maple syrup making process. And you guys have talked about the leisure of it, but it also seems like hugely hard work that you do for fun, right?
Yeah.
And I think that there's a way in which focusing on the process, like all of the artists have, including the process of waiting for the sapsuckers to come and open those wounds on the trees, also avoids the conversation of the commodity of maple syrup, right? As we may remember, the maple syrup heist of 2017, was it? There's millions of dollars of maple syrup that people were just making fun of Canada for, but it was literally millions of dollars in a heist. So any thoughts on this commodity? I mean, Gary and Victoria, you've worked so much on extraction and consumption. Yeah. So
I was actually initially, that was where my interest was going to go. I actually was thinking of building a gift shop for the show, like an installation gift shop with like crazy maple syrup stuff in it, right?
Yeah.
I have a classic, Southern Ontario middle class experience in maple syrup, and that is, my family took me maple syrup, crazy, hokey, stupid maple syrup places when I was a kid outside of Toronto. Some you did, and
we all did it.
and I think we all did. But then when I moved into like this area, I started to see like real, like the way Heather's setup is like kind of intimate and private. And my thoughts about it changed. But yeah, Lucy, I was actually like super interested in the commodification of maple syrup and that. And then, the thing about, for me, working in that milieu, that kind of like political milieu, is it doesn't sustain my interest. Like if it's political, or if it's just about money, or if it's like a crass commercial, if it's along those lines, like my interest is just not. I thought about it, and then I was like, nah, I'm not gonna spend 2 years making work about that. So that's what happened.
And in my case, it's like, as a kid who was born in central London, near all the big train stations. When I came to Canada, it took a while. I was young, but I was very aware of what was going on in my life. And I came from there to here, and it quickly became apparent to everybody in my family that, Canada was making most of its money off of extracting resources. That's what we did. That's what drove our economy. But as a result of that, I don't want to get into like, oh, I was a poor kid, boo-hoo kind of thing. But the fact was, we didn't really have a lot of cash. And one of the things that my family was able to do was take me and my brothers and sisters out to every little quarry and mine site that existed around Ottawa to collect rocks. And that's what we did when we were kids. And I really loved it. And I had to say that a lot of those environments were places that had been created by people and that I spent a lot of my leisure time in. But one of the things that was really great about them was that they had been abandoned. And so good old nature was taking over. And, it gave me a lot of hope about the fact that if you just leave places alone long enough, actually nature can kind of move back in. And you're not going to get back what you had there before. It's not going to be exactly what was there before. You're not going to have exactly the same trees. You're not going to have exactly the same species living in those places, but you will very quickly find that these places can be reestablished. And I observed that as a kid. And that's what I'm more interested in when we visit these sites. It's not so much the economy. It's not so much the money and the commodities there. It's more about, for me, the hopefulness that things can rebound if we just allow them to. That's what I'm really drawn to, and I always have.
Yeah, and that's very much the philosophy of the Nature Conservancy as well, right? Just leave it be. Yeah, connect it.
Yeah.
Because what I found myself really reflecting on as you all were sharing your work with me was that I have this knee jerk whenever I witness some of this extractivist practice, I have this knee jerk, don't do it if you couldn't do it a lot and not hurt the thing, right? So you can't like tap a maple tree all the way around, so it's bad for it. But then in Matthew Ryan Smith's essay, and then in the work that deals with the sapsuckers and all of these things, I was thinking, Matthew says that maple syrup was kind of crucial to the abolitionist movement because maple was replacing sugarcane from the Caribbean. So it was reducing this slave run economy, or an economy run by on the backs of enslaved people. And the sapsuckers are also, so it's that connectedness, I think, that the Nishnabeg discovery story also references. Do you guys have any questions for each other? I don't want to dominate. We're all here on Zoom. We have another 10 minutes if we want. I know it was longer than usual, but we were all prepared to do it 2 hours so everybody could get a chance to talk. Are you not Marianne, the other three of you, are you continuing to reflect on this? Are you gonna now that things are opening up a little bit, do you think you might return to the isolated place, to the
Yeah. Okay, everybody's invited. So next March, February or March, just try to put it in your calendar. Marianne, everybody, really. Lucy,
Awesome.
I mean, really, you're invited. And the more hands, the better, really, either for wood cutting or for collecting the sap and the storytelling. I do think it's interesting hearing, especially, I guess, Brad's and Victoria's work, really talking about storytelling that happens when people get together, especially actually new people, that you don't know as well. Then they have a whole new set of stories, but also generationally, like my dad can remember, family there making maple syrup that I cannot remember. And when my dad is gone, I'm going to remember him and tell my kids, I hope, that come to work on maple syrup, or anybody else, this kind of aspect of like generational practice in a place, and how lovely it is to use that to talk about people and lives and the environment, like the retelling the story of the moment when the starlings came over and made the sky dark, like that experience kind of the place is really lovely. And I'm kind of, it's interesting, the stereotypes about Canada and maple syrup, and that's not what the show is about. I just hope it sort of blows people's minds open really about maple syrup, or actually about any place. Any activity in any place is just way more complicated than the superficial view that you can have of it if you're not involved in it.
Well, that was beautifully said. I don't know how I don't even want to say anything after that.
It was a great time. It was a really good time. That's right.
Well, it makes me. You said that your research now, Heather, is about material culture and inherited objects, right? This idea of the skill as an object, I think, is interesting as well.
Yeah. Actually,
I was watching your face every time they talked about Paul and how he spins his yarns, and it was kind of stone face. So I had this image of you going, "I know."
yeah, I've heard all the stories, but it's nice to hear them again. Actually, my PhD. I'm going to be writing about quilts that were made during World War I in Canada, and quilting is another activity that has storytelling and passing on of skills from one generation to another as an inherent part of the making of an object, and I'm really an evocative object as well. So I'm really excited about kind of exploring, really the Women's Institute and other groups that made these quilts in order to raise money and use the whole community in order to do it. And so
It has that wonderful boringness to it that Victoria was talking about as well.
Yeah,
The difficult labor and then the time, right?
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I'm a big fan of falling into an activity that is somewhat tedious. And, you know, you just,
I like labor.
yeah, you just disappear in it. It's
I always liked
it
labor.
can be very beautiful, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, and just having time, like enough time to go by, and you can't control the time. I find that really interesting about maple syrup. You know, modern life has made it so we're kind of living on like seasonless life. My grandma said a thing about vegetables. She said, it's lettuce in the summer and cabbage in the winter. And it was like, to her, I think she meant like, you're living in this weird way where you think you could have lettuce all winter and you could have a cabbage salad in the summer. Like, it's just crazy to her. And so I think this maple syrup is a season, like it's a season. You have to wait for the weather to be right. And there's just like something to learn in that, something to experience the land really with. It's a lesson kind of in that. But anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's
You can go out there some days and it's just flowing out of the trees and you're just like struggling to keep up with the buckets and everything. And then another day you can go out and there's nothing.
Yeah.
And you just go, oh, okay. And I look around and I think to myself, well, what kind of weather caused that? And I guess something about the environment or what the day, the temperature or overnight temperatures or whatever caused that. But
yeah.
you know, it's made you have to deal with it as it comes at you, which is kind of great in a way.
When I went to have a tour of the sugar bush here, Dave Barnes is in charge of Trees Blood Farms, and he stopped at this big male maple, and he said that yesterday it had been dripping like this, and today it was dripping like he had filled up 2 buckets the day before. And it was because the evening before, the day before, was very cold. Never even occurred to me that would change the sound, right? The atmosphere of the whole thing. And it links to me being out here at the center of the continent, very far from any large bodies of water. You don't really feel it, except that it ranges in temperature by 45 degrees in a day. And you don't really realize all of that work that the water's doing, right? Even though you're not interacting with it. And I think that's a message. Yeah.
Welcome to the prairies.
Oh. There's some prairies with water. This is not those. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, I think that's a perfectly good note to end on. Unless anybody has some final comments, I'll say goodbye and invite everybody to continue to follow all of our digital programming. You'll be able to see some videos of Brad's work installed, which you really must. If you can come, do come. And thank you so much, Gary, Victoria, Marianne, Brad, Heather. It's been a real pleasure. I'm happy we're in go mode. We've been waiting for a while.
Yeah.
Thank you so much all for your time, and we'll stay in touch.
Thanks, Lucy.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anna.
Nice to see everybody.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.